Hello, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to MD Media Show. This is a weekly H panel. And today I'm joined by Dr. Bridge, Skel Kapisa, and Taklai uh, uh, Gab from different parts of the world, actually. And I'm pleased to be back with the H panel. Today we'll be talking about current state of affairs and zooming in into national dialogue, transitional justice, and DDR. This is the topic of the day, the season in Ethiopia, especially from the Arakilo Palace. So we'll have the insights from the panelists today. As usual, we'll start with the first segment, that is the highlight of each panelist over the past week or so. Brooke, let me start with you. As usual, whenever you come, you bring us an important update on humanitarian aid and issues. So why don't you start with you, Doc? Welcome again.
Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. Right now, there's been a very big challenge about getting information out of Tigray from the major humanitarian actors. The what we have as far as nutritional support is a couple of months old. Any sort of food assessments and everything like that, these are several months old. In fact, the last food assessment that was released um, was, I think, more than a year ago. And they've been begging them to do another one, and they haven't. We don't really know the conditions on the ground right now, but we do know that food is getting in at least. Some level of food is getting in, not exactly the level of food that was what was getting in before the suspension, but it's more than what was initially hoped when Getachew said 20% that they were only going to do 20% of the caseload. They're doing significantly more than that, but it's not at the level as it was last time. And I'd hope to show that there was despite the fact that food is resumed, there also needs to be a considerable amount of support for nutrition. Um, children under 5 years old, pregnant and lactating women who are malnourished are in severe trouble right now because a 15 kilogram sack of grain is not going to bring somebody out of malnutrition. It's not going to provide the types of vitamins that a pregnant woman needs to have a healthy pregnancy. It's not going to bring a child under 5 years old from severe malnutrition. These need special foods, special care, in some cases, medical care. And that's not happening. If you look at the chart here, this shows where these services were in March of 2023 when the food was suspended. This was the last month that food was being distributed, and where they are now in March 2024. We see that food has come back to a great extent, not to where the level it was. It's down about 30% from where it was in March of last year, but there's a huge drop in the amount of pregnant and lactating women who are getting nutritional support for their pregnancies or to keep their milk to be able to feed their children. There's also a considerable drop off in the amount of therapeutic food being distributed to children under 5 who are moderately malnourished, and a severe drop in the amount of children under 5 years old who are in the final stages of starvation, severe acute malnutrition, where they are vulnerable to just about every sort of disease, infectious disease you can think of, where their body can't fight off infections anymore, can't fight off basic, flus, things that may not kill them otherwise. They can't fight those off anymore. They need help. They need medical support. They need all of these things that they're not getting, and the capacity to provide those things just isn't there right now. It's just not there. Right now, they're at about 13% of where they were prior to the suspension of food aid. And we hope that some of the reduction in services is due to the fact that food is being distributed, that there is more food. I mean, of course, there's a correlation between having food and not being malnourished, but it's not for the reasons that I described. It's not necessarily, it doesn't bring them out of the woods. There are children right now who are starving, who are not getting the support that they need. And there's no reason for that. They say in the last ECC report, that's the Emergency Coordination Council from Tigray, they said that there was enough therapeutic food for 50,000 treatments. Now, if there's enough for 50,000 treatments, so they shouldn't still be at a level below 1,300 children each month being seen. This is something that it's not getting to the people who need it. It's not getting everywhere. And in many cases, like this number, the 1,200 number, I had to use the number from February because they did not update that for March. This is going in the wrong direction. It looked like it ticked up for a little bit when food and when services were starting to be restored, but now it's fallen back down. And there is no good reason why, if 100,000 people needed this, if 100,000 children or 100,000 pregnant lactating women needed this in March, when for the past 2 months, more food had gotten out to Tigray than had gotten out now. If 100,000 people needed it then they need it now. There's no real good reason why the caseload would be that much lower. So, but they're not saying anything. They're not talking about this. They're not doing nutritional assessments, or if they are, they're keeping them very well hidden. They're using old nutritional assessments that they've mischaracterized to try to show that Tigray is on parity with other regions of Ethiopia, and that's simply not true, and that's not what the findings were when they did the research in Tigray. But that's how it's being sold to sort of, further this narrative that things aren't really so bad in Tigray. And it's just, we need to be clear-eyed about the challenges and about the suffering that's still happening and the genocide that's still happening. This is all related to this deliberate attack on the civilian population of Tigray, and it's still happening, and there needs to be recovery, and there just simply is not the type of recovery that we need. And I know that there's funding problems, but there's always going to be funding problems. I mean, it's a difficult time for funding. But if you're not out there talking about providing data about how many children are starving, how many pregnant women do not have enough nutritional support to carry their child to a healthy birth, when you don't have somebody talking about that, then how do you raise funds? How do you raise funds to stop it? Those are very concerning. It's very concerning the way the UN and some of the major aid organizations have been acting, not just in Tigray, but in Ethiopia in general. And there's a real problem with not being able to trust the people who are supposed to be handling these things. And so if you think if you get more funding, you wonder if that's going to get to the right people. You wonder what the solution is. And it seems like the solution has to be with reform of the humanitarian response in Tigray right now, in Ethiopia more general, and probably in the world. These are not unique, sadly, these aren't unique problems in Tigray. They're not unique to Ethiopia, and they're not even unique to the Horn of Africa. These are things that we're seeing in conflict-affected areas, post-conflict areas. We're seeing a lot of people pretending to do a lot more than's actually being done. And we need to come to a place where that's not allowed. And unfortunately, right now, we're not there yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc, for this important update. You're right. Every conflict-ridden area is just isolated and forgotten. Ezekiel, welcome back again. So, what's the highlight for you in terms of the past few weeks?
Yeah, since we haven't been able to get together and continue our weekly conversation on Ethiopia, I don't have a specific issue. it is possible, but I just wanted to get it together and then maybe reflect a little bit on the three issues that you highlighted in the topics for today's discussion. Now, the Prosperity Party has now a roadmap for the politics that it wants to conduct for the next several years, probably until the next election. What precipitated the new initiative from the Prosperity Party is that the economy is not working as as it should, and the world is really tired. Ethiopians are tired of the discourse of war, civil war, fighting against undefined enemies. Wherever the prime minister goes, they talk on the media, the entire party apparatus. They talk about an enemy. Where that enemy is coming from, nobody knows. But every time there is a conflict, whether that is in Oromia or in Tigray or in Amhara, everybody that picks up arms to fight against this government is actually an instrument of external enemies. But people are tired of it. We don't see the enemies. The external backers are also tired of the discourse of war. I think Western countries that initially supported the new prime minister when he came to power hoped that he would liberalize what they considered a dirigist economy. That is the term that they use these days. The dirigist economy would be liberalized, and the public sector would be opened up for more investment from abroad. And that now seems to have, at least the government seems to have turned a corner when it joined the BRICS and then abandoned the G7 grouping. So the international community is not impressed or isn't impressed by the apparent commitment of the regime to what they consider to be a war of choice that the regime had now waged for the last 5 years, and its unwillingness to end the civil war in the country through political settlement. Remember, even the Pretoria one was required a lot of pressure from African countries and the international community, a lot of sanctions and arms twisting, that it reluctantly went to Johannesburg and signed it. So they're generally tired of it. They did not deliver the performance of this regime, did not turn out to be the reformists that they hoped for. And they're really tired of another war, especially after the outbreak of war in the Middle East, in the Hamas or the Gaza war. So after 5 years of pressure, from economic standstill, from the talk of war all the time, and the fact that the war had now expanded scope, not only in Oromia, but also Amhara region. After almost a year of fighting in the Amhara region, they're not seeing anything changing. In fact, it looks like the Amhara region, the forces that are the armed forces that are fighting against the regime seem to have found a way to really fight it without incurring too much damage on themselves. So it's not really working, and the state of emergency is almost coming to an end in weeks. So the Prosperity Party unveiled on April 24, 2024, through the National Security Council, as a press release of the National Security Council, a roadmap that the Prosperity Party is going to use for ambling until the next election. And this roadmap is on 3 pairs of stilts. The first one is the national dialogue, to be convened by a commission handpicked by the ruling party and entrusted to conduct a national conversation throughout the country, but the commission is not able to implement its findings or its recommendations afterwards. It's going to simply submit its findings to the government itself. The second is a transitional justice program that was developed and launched and is to be conducted by the Ministry of justice of the government. That also is clear that a government that is itself accused of atrocity crimes is unable to, but they have launched that as a program, as an initiative. And the third is the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, the DDR, to be implemented by the newly established National Rehabilitation Commission, which has now estimated what the amount of money that it needs to implement the disarmament and demobilization and reintegration at $700 million. It's probably received about 19 million so far, but the commission itself seems to have been on the verge of being disbanded for lack of money. But these are the three initiatives that the government has now deployed as a way to deal with its politics inside the country and to deal with its donors, to impress the donors. So that's what was unveiled. That's one thing. Now, another thing that I observed was that regionally, well, inside the country, the prime minister and the presidents of the 13 or 12 regions are now sometimes together, sometimes separately, are canvassing. They're just going everywhere to promote these issues, to show what is apparently the government's commitment to dialogue, to justice, and peaceful politics. Now, that is what is the initiative to be used to impress Western donors, but also internal, the domestic politics. Regionally, the government is now viewed as a destabilizer in the region. And that must be contained. And I think the Kenyan government is actually leading that effort to contain the Ethiopian strongman. Now, and the government is really giving more and more reasons for the entire region, including countries in Eastern Africa, to consider this government as a destabilizer, other than the anchor stated that used to be some 10 years ago. What I'm talking about is that after the MOU debacle with the Somali government, the regime has now doubled down on its violation of Somalia's sovereignty. It's now signed a police cooperation with Somaliland. It's invited officials of the Puntland to Addis Ababa. And it's now leaked some information that is appearing in Kenyan news outlets. I think it's a disinformation that Ethiopia is going to import about 70 tons of fertilizer through the port of Lamu. Lamu is way, way, way out there. Djibouti is much, much closer. I don't think they're going to do it, but they're just sending indicators that basically shows the government is now committed to destabilizing, weakening, and possibly dismantling Somalia. Because of Somalia, it's now under increasing pressure and isolation. So really, it looks like the government is now committed to weakening and possibly eradicating Somalia as we know it today. That's basically the observations that I wanted to make.
Thank you, Skel. We'll, as you said, we'll go to the details of at least the three parts in the main topic. Taglai, welcome. As usual, it's after midnight where you are. We appreciate your presence here. What stood out for you?
Thank you for having me on, Getachew, and nice to see Skel and Duke after a long time. And can I start by thanking Duke for describing in detail the serious shortage of food in Tigray, and generally for the past 2 or 3 years he has been a one-man army in terms of giving updates and really working on the humanitarian situation in Tigray. So I would like to say thank you for that. That has been enormous help for us and for Tigray and for a lot of people. And to add one point to that, Duke, I actually saw a clip yesterday of a woman in one of the IDP centers in Tigray, literally pleading with anybody who could listen for food. You could see that she's physically emaciated. You could see the suffering that she's under. And I wouldn't be surprised if she's a typical example of what is happening in the IDP centers in Tigray. And let's not forget that the people who had been ethnically cleansed from Western Tigray are still living in IDP centers. That their condition hasn't changed. And from the graph that you showed us, you could see that the flow of aid is decreasing. It's easy to imagine that the suffering that the people in IDP centers in Tigray must be going through now. And even people who had been removed from southern Tigray, for the most part, in IDP centers. We know that from, I think, a month ago, there was an attempt by Tigray to sort of reclaim Alamata, but the area now is so unstable and so volatile that people don't feel confident to go back to their places. So even though from the news, you would think that southern Tigray has been normalized, that is not the case. People are not returning to southern Tigray as well. So the humanitarian situation is very, very dire in Tigray. So I just wanted to add that to what Duke already described. In terms of other developments, I think the U.S. Special Envoy Mike Hammer should be in Ethiopia now, or at least he should be in Ethiopia anytime soon, from what I have read on the news. And he is there to push the Ethiopian government to take care of some of the issues that Eskiel mentioned. Maybe we will go in detail to them. So I think there's no point in me going to them now. But the other thing that I should highlight is the extremely inflammatory and extremely incendiary speech that the Prime Minister gave in Nekemte, where he did what typical populists, thuggish populists do, where he said that there is actually Eskiel described it, where his speech was vague enough for him to sort of escape responsibility, but clear enough for the people to know whom he was referring to when he said enemies. But essentially said that the Oromo people have enemies surrounding them. And if a prime minister of a country made that sort of speech, now for things to really, really go wrong, all that is required now is for assume that, an Oromo nationalist somewhere assassinates an Amhara political figure, for instance. Or the other way around, an Amhara assassin an Oromo political figure. The Oromos are going to do something really, really terrible against the Amhara people. That is what happens if you create that sort of condition. I trust the Oromo people will not resort to that sort of thing, but that is what you expect to happen. So it's really, really dangerous what he did. But maybe we'll go into those details later.
Great, thank you. The topic we chose is National Dialogue, Transitional Justice and DDR, and anything in between. And this actually not only from Araculo Palace, but it also drew the attention of many actors in the region in Ethiopia, including the OLF-OLA had to issue on May 6 Prime Minister Abiy's conflict resolution roadmap, national dialogue, transitional justice, and DDR. That's the OLF-OLA press release, and many are discussing this topic. So let's start with Eskiel, maybe to build on what you already said and what Taklai implied as well. So the government, as you mentioned, sees these three pillars to push domestically and regionally as well, including what I was showing in Nairobi. He was mentioning this to the international community. This is a speech he made. Let's just play it maybe for a while, if I can.
Skills and education is central to Ethiopia's 10-year development plan, with a focus on sectors like agriculture, wide public involvement. The Commission has thus far had consultative dialogue involving tens of thousands of stakeholders over 2 years. Regional dialogue are eminent, aiming to expand participation further. Third, like many IDA countries, Ethiopia faces unemployment and a skill gap.
So he's basically selling the national dialogue and other efforts he's doing. Scale.
Yeah, like I said, the tripod or the triad, they're all meant to speak at the same time to the international community and also domestically. That's what he was doing, by the way, in Kamte, and today or probably yesterday in Ethiopia, in Bahardar. That's basically what he's doing. He's just taking it to the people and telling for one of these three things that his government is committed to resolving conflicts peacefully, that they have instituted a national dialogue, and he called on the fighters in Amhara region to talk to their regional governments. He did the same thing in Nakamte. And I'm sure that people hear what they want to hear. Out of the 20 minutes that he spoke, the focus on among non-Oromos is that he said something about Amhara or the last government, prior government. That is really what is being drummed up. But the speech in Nakamte was basically tailored to speak to people in Wallaga. I understand Afan Oromo, and I listened to all of it it's in Wallaga and then in Oromia, and of course had a message for the Amhara region as well. Now, Abiy is not constrained by anything. He's not a consistent man. He doesn't care whether what he said in Nakamte is also coherently joining with what he says in Amhara. He doesn't really care. He speaks only to the people right in front of him. So the speech in Nakamte is part of that national dialogue, that he's telling people that he's committed to national dialogue, peaceful resolution. Like I said, of the 20 minutes that he spoke, he started by saying, yes, we have defeated our enemies, our past enemies. We have defeated them. We are victorious, and because we are victorious, we don't need to struggle anymore, is what he said. So basically, it was directed to Wallaga, where he has never been accepted, by the way, among the Oromia region. It's that region that from the very start, from the get-go, did not accept him as a reformed or a prime minister of reform. So after fighting it for 5 years, he went over there. And by the way, the fact that he was in Nakamte, with all of his entourage, and he spoke in Nakamte so glowingly, that itself is enough for them. The fact that he was able to speak from Nakamte without any incident happening was absolutely a victory for him, because it's good for one day. It's the politics of the day. It's not anything more than that. But the next day he was in Mojo, where they had prepared for was that an inauguration of the industrial park in Mojo, about 70 kilometers southeast of Addis. But they couldn't even dine. They couldn't even dine in that area after they prepared their meals. So that was, from what I hear, about 5 million to 15 million, because the the armed groups in that region started to march on them. So they fled. They fled that scene. So this is part of this. They know we are in a national dialogue, and the people. The second is a transitional justice. By the way, there is no transition, and I cannot imagine a transitional justice where there is no transition. It's simply they have already declared that people who have perpetrated crimes during the war or human rights violations in the government, they said they have already identified them, tried them, and then punished them. So it's not the government side. It's not the government. The transitional justice is working in two ways. Number one, they could still talk about Tigray disarming. They could play up that politics of saying, "Oh, we have to disarm Tigray. We have to disarm Tigray," even though the Africa Union observation group had already said Tigray had disarmed. All they have is probably individual rifles. That's basically what it is. But they could still drum up support in the Amhara region or other regions by simply blaming the Tigrayans. I don't know until when, interminably, until the end of days. I don't know, but that's what the propaganda value is, that they could use this to demonize their opponents. On the other hand, they could actually use this as a basket for money, because that $700 million that the commission, the National Rehabilitation Commission, asked, is going to bring some foreign exchange to the coffers, to the Ethiopian coffers, and they are really saying that we are doing the DDR, even though they're not doing a damn thing about that DDR, because the commission itself doesn't have a head. The head was appointed to something else. That's what they're doing. The second thing, the third thing. So all three of them are simply make-believes. They are designed to. The national dialogue, which he says that the commission had consulted with people at all levels. Yes, the commission had said that they had selected 13,000 people to the Constituent Assembly. 13,000. Who they are, who knows? For national dialogue to succeed, there are several factors that are important. One is transparency. How were they selected? The second is inclusiveness. Who is included? The third is a credible convener. It's not a credible convener. These are people that were handpicked by the government. So it's not about really resolving conflicts. That's not the goal. The goal is to cater to the international community, to the Western donors, to give them money on all three, and then use it as a propaganda tool. And by the way, when the national negotiations are going to be declared completed, they're going to come up with constitutional reform, in which the parliamentary system is going to be abolished and replaced by a presidential system, in which he would be elected, the prime minister, the current prime minister, would be elected as the first president of, I don't know what they're going to name it, the Ethiopian Democratic Republic or something like that. He would be the first president. He would be elected for another second term, and probably leaves power after that. That's all there is to it. And in the Amhara region, he also said the same thing today. So, like I said, they're going to use it for politicking domestically and for appealing to Western donors. Other than that, there is nothing real about these three initiatives.
Great. Thank you, Osgal. If you look at the where this all comes from, in the Pretoria Agreement signed on November 2020. Let me just pull this one. And there are a number of important articles there. This is where the transitional justice comes from. Article 10, number 3, where it talks about the government of Ethiopia shall implement a comprehensive national transitional justice policy aimed at accountability, asserting the truth, redress for victims, reconciliation, and healing, consistent with the constitution of the FDR and the African Union Transitional justice policy framework. The transitional justice policy shall be developed with input from all stakeholders and civil society groups through public consultations on formal national policy-making processes. Takla, even on this one, I don't know if there was any input from Tigray. Where, I mean, this is an agreement, for God's sake, an agreement between TPLF and the FDRE, and just, give us a highlight in terms of all these three elements from Tigray's perspective.
Well, I think it's a good point you raised, Getachew. I think it's important to. I have running nose, so I'm sorry, but I think it's very important to remind people of the context under which the agreement was signed. The reason the Tigray representatives in Pretoria signed the agreement was because they were flat out told that if they didn't sign the agreement, the starvation that was going on in Tigray would be blamed on that. Because if you remember, Abiy Ahmed has imposed a complete siege on Tigray. There was nothing that was getting into Tigray. And they went to South Africa and they were told, either you sign the agreement, or either you sign the agreement, or you're going to be held responsible for the suffering that was unfolding in Tigray. So they were arm twisted into signing the agreement. So I think that context is always important to remember. Now, if you could get the previous Article 10 back on the screen, Getachew. Yeah. So what they are saying, the government of Ethiopia shall implement a comprehensive national transitional justice policy. Now, this responsibility is being entrusted on the very entity that was responsible for committing the most serious crimes, in addition to the Eritrean government, of course. Now, the Eritrean government, it wasn't mentioned even once in the document. So there is no way of holding the Eritrean government to account, even though a lot of the atrocities in Tigray were committed by the Eritrean government. So to completely not mention Eritrea or suggest a way for holding Eritrean government, or at least the Eritrean soldiers who committed crimes to account, they didn't bother to mention that in the agreement. So if you're not around in 2022, and if you just read the agreement today, there is no way that you would know Eritrea was even involved in the war, because it's not mentioned even once. But let's leave the issue of Eritrea to one side. Let's just focus on the Ethiopian government. The idea that the Ethiopian regime would be interested in dispensing justice, in providing accountability, in providing restitution to Tigrayan victims is preposterous. And the idea that they dare to write this and believe that we would read the document and believe that this is a serious document, I find it beyond a joke. Even now. But Mike Hammer has been going to Ethiopia almost on a weekly basis. I wonder what he reports back to the US, because I couldn't see any sort of progress happening in Tigray. They say that they have been pushing for DDR, they have been pushing for the Amhara forces to withdraw from Western Tigray and from Southern Tigray, for Eritrean forces to withdraw from Tigray, but none of the latter three have happened. Amhara forces remain in Western Tigray and in Southern Tigray. The Tigrayan administration hasn't been restored in either Western Tigray or Southern Tigray. And the DDR, as you said before, hasn't been really implemented. We don't know. I mean, at one point, the African Union said that 99% of the DDR process had been completed. And then a couple of days ago, we heard that actually it hasn't been done. So it's an absolute shambles in terms of what has been implemented, what hasn't been implemented. But what we know is the idea that the Ethiopian government would provide justice to Tigrayan victims is an act of adding insult to injury to Tigrayan victims.
Thank you, Tarla. I think you are done. Duke, I want to go to a subject well, the DDR. So to give context to our viewers, this is the Pretoria Agreement signed on November 3rd, 2022. And then the leaders from both sides went to Nairobi. And on the 12th of November 2022, they signed what is called now the Nairobi Declaration. On Nairobi Declaration, I mean, if you look at Article 8 of Pretoria Agreement, it implies or it mentions about the responsibility of the international boundaries and federal facilities. So where it says the ENDF shall be deployed along the international boundaries of Ethiopia and shall safeguard the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the security of the country from foreign incursion and ensure that there will be no provocation or incursions from either side of the border. This is Pretoria Agreement. And in Nairobi, Article 2D, the Nairobi Declaration clearly mentions that this is disarmament of Tigray armed combatants. Article 2D, disarmament of heavy weapons will be done concurrently with the withdrawal of foreign and non-ANDF forces from the region. This is what they signed on the, within let's say a week from Pretoria Agreement. Your experience on peace building and DDR versus the DDR we are witnessing or being sold by Arakilo. What is your take on that?
Yeah, it's, I have experience in this field, but this is essentially what Pascal, what Teklai was saying. It's a farce. It's a shambles, and it is a label for funding. It's a way to get funding into Ethiopia under a different name. DDR is something that the West got excited about. The UN particularly gets excited about. There's not a lot of evidence to support the efficacy of various tools of DDR. Not that it's a waste of time, certainly. I mean, the theory is that if you help ex-combatants reintegrate into society, and provide tools and services and create conditions for them to be able to thrive as civilians, then you won't see a resurgence of violence. But not only you won't see like the war start again, but there are other fears of that, like in Colombia, where I have some experience in their DDR process. They were worried about the fighting, the civil war starting again, but they were also worried about former combatants joining narco groups, either some of the cartels or doing that. These are all legitimate concerns, because you have what they said was something like 270,000 people in Tigray that are no longer, they don't have jobs anymore, because there was nothing left over after the war. There is no economy right now. I mean, there is some. It's not completely flattened, but they don't have an economy that they can take advantage of. A DDR program is supposed to have a number of components. It's supposed to be integrated as they've pretended to do. It's supposed to be integrated into some reconciliation, some reform, political reform, security reform. It's supposed to include all of these things, and those have to actually be real programs. It can't, none of this can be a farce, or it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. DDR is something that you do when you're done fighting, when you want to be done having violence, having conflict, having war in the country, when people are ready to start living together, when the government wants them to live together peacefully. That's when you do DDR. Now, I don't know if there's really a desire from the Ethiopian government to see that happen in Ethiopia, for people to live peacefully, because these are now just concepts that are bought and sold and used to try to raise money for, just to try to bring in new funding. In a normal process, you would have psychosocial support, you would have vocational training, you would have family reunification, people, fighters who came back to their homes and find, that their families are gone, that they're now in this unending displacement situation where they're afraid to go home, or they can't go home, or there's people, people who demobilized into displacement camps. The idea that you would have a DDR process that would go DD for the disarmament and the demobilization, and then R would come after a year and a half, that would never get off the ground. It was, I mean, that's the worst possible thing you could do, is to just let people sit and starve and not have any access to the economy, not have any services really to speak of. That would be the worst thing you could do. Now, what they were banking on, I think, is that the TDF would not go back to violence because they realized that they were in a position where it wouldn't help them to keep fighting. They were banking on that, I think. And I think that's what we've seen, because there's been absolutely no DDR going on. Anybody from the peace building community that says that there's an actual DDR process going on in Ethiopia should not be trusted, because that either means that they don't know what DDR is, or they are willing to pretend that something that doesn't exist exists for the purposes of having a program in Ethiopia, or if you're getting funding for Ethiopia, doing something like this. DDR does not exist in Ethiopia. And every politician that says we're working on DDR, we're working on these things, they're lying. They're just flat out lying. And this is a horrible thing to lie about, because you saw that there was this scare, there were these allegations that there were Tigrayan fighters fighting in Sudan, and that was quickly denied by the interim regional government. That's the type of thing, though, that you're worried about. Not, of course, that the TPLF is going to join forces with somebody from Sudan or something like that, but that you have a considerable number of people who are sitting in displacement camps with nothing, no future ahead of them. Nobody's saying, here's a vocation. They're not going to trust anybody now that says, here's a vocational program that's going to start in a year, because they know that it's not going to start, because they've been promised that before. That is the fear, is that for those guys who have nowhere to turn to illicit behaviors, illegal behaviors, possibly violent behaviors, or if you, God forbid, if you saw the TDF splinter, and you have groups then that now you're dealing with 4, 5, 6, 7 different groups that are fighting the government, and now you can't make peace with all of them. You can try to make peace with some of them, try to weaken some of them, then you have a state of perpetual violence, cycles that will not end in possibly our lifetimes. That's the fear that you have there. And if you keep ignoring DDR, if you keep ignoring reintegration, then it's just as bad as leaving the weapons there. It's just as bad as not having the peace agreement, because then it's a recipe for disaster. In a real DDR program, there would be services that help people reintegrate into society. There would be services to make sure that women, female combatants, of which 20% or so of the TDF were female, they have different needs coming out of conflict. They go into conflict for different reasons also. Often they have different experiences in conflict often, and they have different needs coming out of conflict. Those have to be addressed. But how far away are we from actually thinking about the nuance of what these services would look like? Because we know that they're not going to occur. They're never going to happen. There was an opportunity to get people to work in Tigray. That had to come with funding, that had to come with a good program. But how do you get funding to Tigray when you have a middleman who is not a responsible figure, that's somebody that everybody's pretending didn't do horrible things in Tigray, enough to have him in the room, but you know that the federal government is not going to let this type of aid flow into Tigray to rebuild the economy. So sadly, the former combatants in Tigray have been reintegrated into Tigrayan society, but Tigrayan society is still under attack by the federal government, and it's still not, there's still no availability of jobs, education, vocational training, psychosocial support, all of these things. There are people that are doing this piecemeal, and it's very important that they're doing this. where they're doing this in different places, but it's not coordinated, it's not integrated, and it's not effective as a reintegration plan because there's so much of it that's crap. National dialogue, for the reasons that were described, is nonsense. You pick the people ahead of time. We're not even talking about what the real issues of national dialogue are because we know that it's fake. These are the problems. It can't all be fake. Something has to be real. The bar is lowered so far when it comes to right now, when it comes to Ethiopia, when it comes to this regime, when it comes to this leader, the bar has been lowered so far that it is the people who pay the price are former combatants and the civilians that come under attack, that are punished, that are part of the collective punishment that happens whenever there's violence right now in Ethiopia by the federal government or by Eritrea, and it's very sad.
Thank you, Doc, for that. Scale on one of the, like I said, the press release is given a 4-page press release by OLF OLA on the 7th of May. They mention about how this is a PR gimmick for getting funding, and even after getting the funding, they specifically mention from the IMF, World Bank, the government will continue with the war. And they also mention here how the country is, there is still active conflicts everywhere and aerial attacks. They mention Walega area, Guji area, central, north, west Shoa, and in the Amhara region, 4 zones. All this compared to what we know as well now, how aid was diverted among other actors by the federal government and diverted for exporting as if it was produced in Ethiopia, made in Ethiopia, or produced in Ethiopia wheat, and B, for also feeding the defense forces, the military. So the international community, including the US, knows this very well. But when they were confronted with the question of they will be kicked out of the country if they were to disclose that as a fact, they had to keep quiet and continue as business as usual. So given all that, do you see any possibility of, again, those who are funding this asking the right questions in terms of is this authentic, is this genuine, and so on, or will they go just business as usual?
Yeah, I mean, the IMF and the World Bank, they have other issues for not supporting. I think you've heard the Prime Minister saying about the 10-year perspective plan in the speech that he gave in Kenya. So we just heard him linking the effort about national dialogue with his desire for economic development in agriculture, in infrastructure, and everything that he said about what would be needed for Ethiopia. So it's clear that he's linking it, and he's using that platform to appeal to international donors, because it's the IDA that actually met in Nairobi. So it was a good platform, and for some reason I don't understand that he did not even spend the night there. He went there and delivered that speech and went away. So the IMF and the World Bank, to fund the 10-year perspective plan, and what the government actually asked for is about $12 billion for the 10-year perspective plan. For now, they were negotiating about $3.7 billion for the first couple of years, but even that is held up by the IMF, because it's not only about the devaluation of the dollar, which the IMF wants. It's also the vanity projects, the budgeting, the spending plan that they are really asking for. Where do you get all that money on the vanity projects, like $10 billion on palace or other projects that the Prime Minister's petty projects? The money is not in the budget, or other projects that they are running, like the Republican Guard, about 60,000 men strong right now, or persons strong right now, and having its own intelligence. This is not the military intelligence. This is not the civilian intelligence. The Republican Guard has its own intelligence unit equipped with human intelligence and electronic intelligence by itself, and that is totally commanded by the Prime Minister. This is separate from the government institutions. All of that is funded. All of that money that the Republican Guard spends for salaries and other expenses goes into the economy. So the IMF did not want to fund, because they had all of these demands about budgeting, budget allocation, funding. Now it's on top of that the issue of these three issues of national dialogue, transitional justice, and DDR are brought up. Now, it is true that I think this is important to underscore. All three of them, all the national dialogue, the way it is designed, the way it worked is designed for conflict resolution and political transformation. That's the goal. That's the goal of national dialogue. It's not only conflict resolution. It is political transformation. It has to be tied together. But the way this one is designed in Ethiopia is that in addition to other issues, in addition to the inclusivity, the transparency, the credibility, and all of those factors, if you leave that alone, the design itself is not inclusive. The fact that the commissioners do not have the right to implement it tells you that this is not a national dialogue. It's not a national dialogue by any level of imagination. It's not. Now, this is for deeply divided societies. These all three are actually designed for deeply divided post-conflict societies, as Duke said. You cannot conduct national dialogue while the country is engulfed by war. And you cannot have a political transformation if all the political actors that were the belligerents are not involved in the national dialogue. And there is no way that the fighters could be involved in this. It is not a national dialogue by the design that we know, but it has its own history, by the way. It was started by concerned citizens of generals and former generals, retired generals, diplomats, who got together, who were worried about the direction of the country before the Tigray war. So they came together and say, we need a comprehensive settlement of the political issues that are dividing the Ethiopian society. That's before the Tigray war. But the prime minister, if you remember, maybe some of you remember, he said that these people that are talking about, the politicians that are talking about national dialogue, are not interested in national dialogue. They are interested in elite bargaining and which ministry goes to another. So that is how he took it away from the concerned citizens that actually launched this process. It was the commission was instituted about 2.5 years ago. And for 2.5 years ago, we do not know what they were doing. Absolutely nothing. He revived it because of political expediency right now. It was revived for political expediency. But the government says we are elected. There is no changing with the institutions of the government. That's not included. It's simply surface issues that they're going to discuss. Well, how is it a national dialogue that will end in restructuring the state and a political settlement that would restructure the state? If that is not included, it cannot be a national dialogue. That's about, so there is a lot of contradiction in it. The same about the transitional justice. By the way, it's not just about the conflict in the north. It is included in the Pretoria Agreement, but this DDR applies to Tigray, but it should apply to everywhere else, because You cannot settle the conflict in the north and then the rest of the country is in at war. It cannot be really a DDR that would settle the issues, reintegrate the armed combatants, and return them to civilian life, or maybe integrate them to the security apparatus. So it's incomplete. If it is only between Tigray and the government itself, it would be incomplete. And that's why it is really premature to talk about transitional justice, much less one that is commanded by the Ministry of Justice. The culprit cannot be a judge. You cannot be the judge and jury in which you are actually the perpetrator with your accomplice, the perpetrator of the heinous crimes that actually brought the country to the verge of collapse. And with the issue about the DDR, I think the United Nations has different categories depending on the circumstances. They call it that there is the Integrated Disarmament, Demobilization, Reintegration Standards, the IDDRS. So depending on the conflict that was fought, it will be designed or fashioned in a way that would fit the local situation. I know that when they were discussing with the OLA in Tanzania, the concept was actually about RRI. It was about rehabilitation, reform, and integration rather than DDR. So if it's not comprehensive, it's not going to resolve anything. But at the end of the day, Prosperity Party is not interested in national dialogue, not interested in transitional justice. They have said so, and they're not interested in DDR. All they want is some capital infusion from outside, and that's what they're parading it all over the place.
Great, thank you, Scale. Taklai, we are closing to the end of the hour, but I can't help but mention Article 9 where of the Pretoria Agreement, where it says, number 2, the federal government shall ensure and facilitate the representation of the Tigray region in the federal institutions, including the House of Federation and House of People's Representatives, in according with the FDR Constitution and applicable laws. And as far as I remember, we haven't seen that. Tigray is just in Tigray, and I don't know even how it's represented by any form in the federal government.
Well, I mean, you're right. That hasn't happened, and I don't even think it's one of the issues that they are talking about now. I think it's one of these issues, the issues that have been brushed aside, completely forgotten. But I don't even know how they would implement it if there was a desire to do that, because the TPLF hasn't got its legal status, its legal recognition. And the TPLF, as far as the federal government is concerned, is now, I don't even know what it is. It's some sort of limbo. It's not a legal party. It's not registered, so it can't represent Tigray. And how would Tigray be represented in the Ethiopian parliament? Because in the Ethiopian parliament, it's essentially it's a set of parties that are there, and the TPLF is now not a registered party. So I don't even know how it would work without solving that problem, without solving the problem of the TPLF and its legal status and all that. But what is interesting is that it's not even something that they are talking about. So, a lot of aspects of the Pretoria Agreement have simply been ignored. I think that is a point that we should make. And it was interesting, Getachew, that you mentioned the fact that the agreement, the one that was signed in Nairobi, said that the DDR of the Tigrayan forces should happen concurrently with the withdrawal of Eritrean and Amhara forces. I think it says non-ENDF forces, right? Because they
foreign and non-ENDF forces.
Yeah, they had to do some sort of mental gymnastics to avoid mentioning Eritrea. So that's the reason they said non-ENDF. But anyway, the assumption there, the implied assumption there, is that it would have been unfair if they said the TPLF or the Tigray forces should disarm and not demand the other forces to leave. Because the reason Tigray forces had to arm was because they had to defend Tigray against those forces, right? That's the assumption, even though it's not spelled out, but that's the assumption. But in the implementation, you would expect the way this would be executed, the way this will be implemented, the reasonable way this should be implemented, you would expect first the non-END forces withdraw, and as a function of that, and in proportion to that, Tigray forces would disarm. That would be the reasonable implementation, right? But that hasn't been what has been happening. The focus has been on the disarmament of the Tigray forces without pushing for the Eritrean and the Amhara forces to leave. So the way that specific provision of the agreement has been implemented is on the whole wrong, because the very reason you're saying concurrently is because the Tigray forces should be armed until Tigray is free. That is the whole point of this, but that is not how they are trying to implement it. And if I could add one more point, I think the OLA used an interesting word, that gimmick. And I think that's the word that you could use to describe literally everything that Abiy does. It's a gimmick to sort of push a problem into the long grass, as they say. I'm going to turn off my camera to deal with my nose, but if you don't mind, I'm going to keep speaking. So the national dialogue, for instance, I mean, national dialogue by definition, it should encompass the entire nation, right? But as far as I know, the major parties in the country, the opposition parties like the Marara's party, for instance, the Oromo Congress Party, the OLA, the TPLF, and the other parties have simply rejected it. And you can't have a national dialogue where the big opposition parties in the country have rejected it. So that simply is not, even if we were to assume that this was a good faith attempt on the part of Abiy, but of course it wasn't a good faith attempt. This is a gimmick. This is a way of telling the international community that Abiy was trying to solve the problem that they want him to solve by saying, well, for the fundamental political problems in the country, I have the national dialogue. For issues of justice, for issues of reconciliation and all that, I have the transitional justice. For other things, I have other commissions. Even the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, it's a gimmick. It's not right. It's not a human rights commission. It's a gimmick to tell the Western bosses that, well, Ethiopia has a human rights commission and violations of human rights are being reported by an allegedly independent body. And you could go on. Even the election board is a gimmick. I mean, the last election, for instance, it wasn't really an election. Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed ran alone in Oromia. There wasn't any opposition party in Oromia, but the election board, of course, didn't have any problem saying that it was a legitimate election. So everything that Abiy Ahmed does in Ethiopia is a gimmick. So I just wanted to highlight that point. And another interesting point that Eskel mentioned is Abiy's vanity project. I think, the one fundamental problem between, Eskel, for instance, he might consider the things that Abiy has been invested in, the amusement park, the bridge and everything, vanity projects. But for Abiy, they are serious projects. And that is the fundamental problem in Ethiopia. So if somehow, for instance, Abiy was to secure a lot of funding now, he wouldn't use it to build schools or to, for instance, expand healthcare or anything of that sort. He will build more parks because for him, there are issues of utmost priority. So there is a fundamental difference in terms of how he perceives, what is vanity and what is not. And I actually don't see how he's going to reconcile that with his Western donors, because I could presume that they are pushing him to change direction in terms of where he focuses.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tatlai. Duke, your final thoughts on the topic, including what's happening and what might happen and who should do what.
Yeah, My final thoughts is just that to have any sort of reintegration, to have any sort of a real credible national dialogue, to move forward in any way, Tigray has to move forward. There has to be, people have got to be allowed to go back to their homes. There were 1 million people who were displaced. Now they're saying that they may have had, there may be 860,000. Maybe that's the new estimate. I haven't been able to see the data that was collected in November and December, almost 6 months ago, 5 months ago now. That hasn't been released because the government won't allow that to be released, is what I believe is the case. These were released in the past without a problem when they weren't necessarily asking for permission. Now that they're asking for permission, you don't see so much come out. But you just can't have a large contingent of the population be stuck in displacement camps with no vision for the future, with no ability to say we'll be able to get back to the farms by the time it's time to start, preparing the soil or anything. We're going to miss another harvest. We're going to miss another year of rebuilding, reconstruction, rehabilitation that needs to happen in Tigray. All of these things have to happen, not just because the people of Tigray deserve to be able to live in peace. Of course they do. But that's not the only reason these things need to happen. These things have to move forward because if Tigray is left as a battlefield, which is essentially what they're trying to do, what the international community is pleased to let happen, is to see Tigray continue to be a place where there are not schools for children, where there are not hospitals for the sick, where there's not even food for the hungry. There's no services for starving children. Everybody who's okay with that is a bad actor in this situation. Everybody who's okay with that is not working for peace, even though they can have all the celebrations they want. They can have all of the events and they can congratulate themselves on getting something signed. But if they're not working to figure out how to get people back to their homes, how to pry these lands out of the grip of people who have decided that this is going to be their spoils of war. Eritrea has decided that Arab is going to be theirs because that's going to be their reward for slaughtering civilians. Amhara region has decided that Western Tigray is going to be theirs because that's their reward for slaughtering innocent people in Tigray. And the southern part of Tigray, the southern half of the southern zone, and the southern half of the northwestern zone, and the northern half of the northwestern zone, the northern half of the central zone. There's still occupation in parts of those, or there's activity from foreign troops. None of that's happened. And if none of that happens, that's where the farce ends. You can't BS that, because if it doesn't, if people can't go home, they can't reintegrate into society, they can't have economic, they can't plant food that's going to grow, that's going to feed them and their families for the next, they're going to be dependent on aid because they're not allowed to go back to their farms. If all of that isn't happening, I mean, the nonsense, the gimmicks, the farce, it can only go so far until there's real consequences that cannot be ignored. And I have to give the international community credit that they can ignore a lot of suffering. They can ignore a lot of consequences, but it's going to come to a point where they cannot ignore it anymore. They have pushed this down the road, kicked this down the road, expecting what? They expecting some pivot from Abiy that he's going to become a person that actually wants to see peace in Ethiopia. I don't think he can withstand peace in Ethiopia. I mean, that's just my opinion as an outsider, but they don't have a plan here. And what they have here is nonsense. What they have here is crap. But the thing is that real people are suffering right now. As my friend said, in these displacement camps, they've been practicing this trickle down aid where they might not be providing aid directly to the people in the displacement camps, but they think, well, if we provide some food to the community, to the host community, hopefully they'll be helping out the people in the displacement camp. And they have done so admirably. but when they run out of food, they don't have any more food to give. They don't have any more food to give to people who are displaced, who do not have any choice but to be displaced. There's no way for them to go back right now because this is occupied land. They'll be going back to ethnic cleansing. There are still people coming out of those areas. There are still new displacements happening on a weekly basis because of what they're going through in these places. So we're stuck. We are stuck. The peace process is in every single one of those displacement camps. That's where the peace process is. It's stuck, just like the people there are stuck. And there needs to be, somebody needs to take this seriously. The international community, they have absolutely no right to ignore the people who are displaced right now in Tigray. They have absolutely no right. If they want to say that they're going over there to talk about peace, they need to be talking about the displaced people in Ethiopia. That's my final word. Thank you for having me on the show.
Great. Thank you, Dirk. Skell, final thoughts?
Yeah. I would just kind of summarize what I said before, but I just wanted to make 2 points, agreeing and qualifying what Tekla was saying. This thing about the TPLF not being re-registered or restored to a legal party, that is not about the law. It's not that there is a law in Ethiopia that allows for deregistering and not allowing for re-registering. There is no law like that. The issue is the reason that TPLF is not restored has nothing to do with the law or even issues with the TPLF. The reason that the Prosperity Party does not want TPLF to be registered or re-registered or restored. Look, TPLF could re-register. That's not a problem. As a new party, they can. As a new party. What they cannot do is to be restored as the same party that existed before the war. What is the reason for that? What is the difference if you re-register and restore? The difference is if you restore, TPLF has assets, money in the bank. At least it's entitled to 1/4 of the EPRDF assets that the Prosperity Party inherited at the end, and 1/4 was reserved for TPLF. But during the war, they have used up all that money, the assets, and they have raided all the assets of TPLF. They don't want that. The TPLF could be re-registered as a new party because as a new party, you cannot say, I had assets. You're dissolved. So that is basically the issue. And you can see the level to which this government could go and mangle the laws of the country simply to promote its own thievery. That's basically what the issue is about as far as TPLF is concerned. The second is, I absolutely agree with you. The vanity projects, yeah, we can call it vanity projects, but for Abiy, that's the development. That's what he said. Those of you who are criticizing me for what I'm doing right now do not know how a country grows. You don't know what development means. The issue is not really a different conceptions of development. It emanates this idea of beautifying the city and beautifying the countryside or building hotels all over the country as a sign of development. For Abiy is honestly, he believes in it because he is one of those narcissistic leaders who is self-absorbed and holds a sense of entitlement and authority to do anything that he wants without consulting with others. That's the result of it. So I agree with you that it's not vanity for him. He's really doing a lot of things for the country. But finally, on the issue of the government's initiative, all three programs, as we said, are bound to fail because the design of the efforts violates all principles that can ensure success in all three fronts. The national dialogue is being conducted not to resolve conflicts, but simply to consolidate power. We'll come back to this issue and we'll see once they're done with the national dialogue. The transitional justice program is run by the very regime that is accused of all kinds of atrocity crimes. And in that case, it's unlikely to succeed. The DDR program has already been made a political football to harass opponents, such as the Tigray case. So overall, this is just a gimmick, as you say, designed to impress Western donors by giving them what they want and what they've been asking for. And domestically, the prime minister and regional presidents are about to storm and go everywhere, and the political the operatives are going to go to the lowest level of administration, promoting this issue as if the government is doing something. But most importantly, what I wanted to add to this thing is what they're doing with regard to Somalia. With the kind of, they are trying to undermine the Somalia government when they continue after the MOU. The entire world condemned the Ethiopian government, but they still are promoting the idea of the MOU, which should be really dead, which is a violation of bedrock principles of international relations on which states exist. It's the architecture of peace and security in the world. You violate that, and then you cannot continue to be a part of the community of nations. But they are doubling down, like I said. They're signing agreements with the Somaliland. They're working with the Puntland government simply to undermine the Somali government. What would the world say? After 30 years of trying, the world had gotten to a point of propping Somalia as a nation. And the Ethiopian government was a part of this process by the United Nations to help the Somalis re-establish their own government. And the Ethiopian government, which had spent about 30 years, maybe 25 years, as a peacekeeping force, is undermining its own effort for only political reasons, because their own political miscalculation had backfired to make them a pariah in the international arena. To recover from that, they are going to the extent of undermining the Somalia government. This is a shame. And what the rest of the international community that had invested blood and treasure in helping the Somalis form their own government, are they going to take this and they're going to simply look at this Ethiopian government and say, well, we're business is as usual. If you make some changes in the economic arena, we'll work with you. It is a travesty even in international relations, as far as I'm concerned.
Great, thank you, Skell. Any final thoughts, Taklai, if you haven't made one already?
Yeah, just one point. I think also Duke emphasized it, but the patience of people in Tigray is wearing thin now, especially of people in IDP centers. 2 winters in IDP centers, and the third one looking increasingly likely. I wouldn't be surprised if people resorted to very, very desperate measures, and nobody could tell what those desperate measures could. They could pick up arms and start attacking federal forces or something of that sort. So I think people like Mike Hammer have a huge responsibility to facilitate the return of people in IDP centers to Western Tigray, to their homes, for them to start having a semblance of normal life. I think that's a very important point. If they are trying to pretend that is not a problem, it's going to be a very, very serious problem for Ethiopia and for them. I mean, nobody could predict what a desperate people could do. From what I have been hearing, from what I have been reading, from the conversations that I have been having with people in Tigray, the sense of desperation is really, really growing in Tigray. The other point, I would just pose the question for Skell and Duke and Getachew to ponder about, and maybe we'll expand on it next time. My sense is that the US government and the Western governments seem to want to support Abiy. They seem to be seeing something that we couldn't see, which is why, even though they know that the transitional justice is a sham process, even though they know that the national dialogue is a gimmick, they are happy to support it. They are happy for Abiy to pretend that he's doing those things, even though they know that is a facade, that is a lie. So it looks like that there is something that they see, because on the face of it, you would think Ethiopia is going from worse to worse, and you would think that the US government and the European Union and other countries would pressure Abiy to change course, but we don't see that. And I wonder what it is that, I mean, I know that Iskel mentioned they are trying to make Abiy to liberalize the economy and all that, so I understand that. But what is a liberalized economy in a war zone? I couldn't see the point of that. So I really struggle to understand why it is that they are not calling out Abiy Ahmed. So maybe something to ponder about.
Great. I think maybe that could be a topic we can discuss in one of the episodes. Thank you, gentlemen. Tarlai from Sweden, Duke and Scale from the East Coast. Good night from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
For those who have been following us for many years now, 3-4 years, we have been doing the H panel, and recently we were not tuning, but we will try to come back on a weekly basis. Please share, subscribe, and like so that many can view based on YouTube's algorithm that whenever there is a lot of liking and subscribing and sharing, they tend to spread it more. Your host was Getachew Sofa. Good night from here. Bye.